Book 3 The Pathfinders of Africa. Chapter 17 of the Book of Missionary Heroes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brias No. The Book of Missionary Heroes by Basil Mathews. Chapter 17 The Ch5 The Slave Girls. George Grenfell. The building of the steamship. When David Livingstone lay dying in his hastily built hut in the heart of Africa, with his black companions Susi and Shuma attending him, almost his last words were, "How far away is the Luapula?" He knew that the river to which the Africans gave that name was only a short distance away, and that it flowed northward. He thought that it might be the upper reaches of the Nile, which had been sought by men through thousands of years, but which none had ever explored. Livingstone died in that hut, and never knew what Stanley, following his steps, discovered later, viz., that the Luapula was really the upper stretch of the Congo, the second largest river in the world, 3,000 miles long, flowing into the Atlantic. The basin of the Congo would cover the whole of Europe from the Black Sea to the English Channel. In the year when Livingstone died, and before Stanley started to explore the Congo, a young man who had been thrilled when reading the travels of Livingstone sailed to the west coast of Africa to the Cameroons. His name was George Grenfell, a Cornish boy, born at Sancreed, 4 miles from Penzance in England, who was brought up in Birmingham. He was apprenticed at 15 to a firm of hardware and machinery dealers. Here he picked up, as a lad, some knowledge of machinery that helped him later on the Congo. He had been thrilled to meet at Bristol College, where he was trained for his missionary work, a thin, worn, heroic man of tried steel, Alfred Saker, the great Cameroon missionary, and Grenfell leapt for joy to go to the dangerous west coast of Africa, where he worked hard, teaching the Africans to make tables and bricks, and to print and read, healing them and preaching to them. When Stanley came down the Congo to the sea and electrified the world by the story of the great river, Grenfell and the Baptist Missionary Society, which he served, conceived the daring and splendid plan of starting a chain of mission stations right from the mouth of the Congo eastward across Africa. In 1878 Grenfell was on his way up the river, travelling along narrow paths flanked by grass often 15 feet high, and crossing swamps and rivers, till after 13 attempts and in 18 months he reached Stanley Pool, February 1881. 1,000 miles of river lay between Stanley Pool and Stanley Falls, and even above Stanley Falls lay 1,300 miles of navigable river. Canoes were perilous. Hippopotami upset them, and men were dragged down and eaten by crocodiles. They must have a steamer right up there beyond the falls in the very heart of Africa. Grenfell went home to England, and the steamer Peace was built on the Thames, Grenfell watching everything being made from the crank to the funnel. She was built, launched, and tried on the Thames, then taken to pieces and packed in 800 packages, weighing 65 pounds each, and taken to the mouth of the Congo. On the heads and shoulders of 1,000 men the whole ship and the food of the party were carried past the rapids, over 1,000 miles along narrow paths, in peril of snakes and leopards and enemy savages, over streams crossed by bridges of vine creepers, through swamps, across ravines. Grenfell's engineer, who was to have put the ship together, died. At last they reached Stanley Pool. Grenfell, with 8 negroes, started to try to build the ship. It was a tremendous task. Grenfell said that the Peace was prayed together. It was prayer and hard work and gumption. At last the ship was launched, steam was up, the Peace began to move. "She lives, master, she lives!" shouted the excited Africans. 1,000 thrilling adventures came to him as he steamed up and down the river, teaching and preaching, often in the face of poisoned arrows and spears. We are now going to hear the story of one adventure. The Steamers Journey. The crocodiles drowsily dozing in the slime of the Congo river bank stirred uneasily as a strange sound broke the silence of the blazing African morning. They lifted their heavy jaws and swung their heads downstream. Their beady eyes caught sight of a thing mightier than 1,000 crocodiles. It was pushing its way slowly upstream. The sound was the throb of the screw of the steamer, from whose funnel a light ribbon of smoke floated across the river. An awning shaded the whole deck from bow to stern. On the top of the awning, under a little square canopy, stood a tall young negro. The muscles in his sturdy arms and his broad shoulders rippled under his dark skin as the wheel swung round in his swift, strong hands. The steamer drove upstream, while the crocodiles, startled by the wash of the boats, slid suddenly down the bank and dived. A short bearded man, dressed in white duck, stood on deck at the bows where the steamer's name, Peace, was painted. He was George Grenfell. His keen eyes gleamed through the spectacles that rested on his strong arched nose. By his side stood his wife, looking out up the river. They were searching for the landing place and the hut roofs of some friendly riverside town. At last, as the bows swung around the next bend in the river, they saw a village. The Africans rushed to the bank and hurriedly pushed out their tree trunk canoes. Grenfell shouted an order. A bell rang. The screw stopped and the steamer lay to, while he climbed down into the ship's canoe and was paddled ashore. The wondering people pushed and jostled around them to see this strange man with his white face. The Slave Girls. As they walked up among the huts, speaking with the men of the town, Grenfell came to an open space. As his quick eyes looked about, he saw two little girls standing bound with cords. They were tethered like goats to a stake. Their little faces and round eyes looked all forlorn. Even the wonder of the strange bearded white man hardly kept back the tears that filled their eyes. "What are these?" he asked, turning to the chief. The African pointed up the river. Grenfell's heart burned in him as the chief told how he and his men had swept up the river in their canoes, armed with their spears and bows and arrows, and had raided another tribe. "And these," said the chief, pointing to the girls, who began to wonder what was going to happen, "these are two girls that we captured. They are some of our booty. They are slaves. They are tied there till someone will come and buy them." Grenfell could not resist the silent call of their woeful faces. Quickly he gave beads and cloth to the chief, and took the little girls back with him to the river bank. As they jumped into the canoe to go aboard the SS Peace, the two girls wondered what this strange new master would do with them. Would he be cruel? Yet his eyes looked kind through those funny round shining things balanced on his nose. The girls at once forgot all their sorrows when they jumped on board this wonderful river monster. They felt it shiver and throb and begin to move. The bank went further and further away. The Peace had again started upstream. The girls stood in wonder and gazed with open eyes as the bank slid past. They saw the birds, all green and red, flashing along the surface of the water, and the huge hippopotami sullenly plunging into the river like the floating islands of earth that sail down the Congo. Their quick eyes noted the quaint iguana, like giant lizards, sunning themselves on the branches of the trees over the stream, and then dropping like stones into the stream as the steamer passed. The Slave Girl's Brother. Then suddenly, as they came round a bend in the river, all was changed. There ahead Grenfell saw a river town. The canoes were being manned rapidly by warriors. The bank bristled with spears in the hands of ferocious savages, whose faces were made horrible by gashes and loathsome tattooing. In each canoe men stood with bows in their hands and arrows drawn to the head. The throb of the engine ceased. The ship slowed up, but the canoes came on. The men of this Congo town only knew one thing. Enemies had, only a few weeks earlier, come from down river, had raided their town, burned their huts, killed many of their braves, and carried away their children. Here were men who had also come from down the river. They must therefore be enemies. Their chief shouted an order. In an instant a score of spears hurtled at the ship and rattled on the steel screens around the deck. The yell of the battle cry of the tribe echoed and re-echoed down the river. Grenfell was standing by the little girl. Suddenly one of them, with dancing eyes, shouted and waved her arms. "What is it?" cried Grenfell to her. "See, see!" she cried, pointing to a warrior in a canoe who was just poising a spear. "That is my brother! That is my brother! This is my town!" "Call to him," said Grenfell. Her thin childish voice rang out, but no one heard it among the warriors. Again she cried out to her brother. The only answer was a hail of spears and arrows. Grenfell turned rapidly and shouted an order to the engineer. Instantly a shriek, more wild and piercing than the combined yells of the whole tribe, rent the air. Again the shriek went up. The warriors stood transfixed, with spear and arrow in hand, like statues in ebony. There was a moment's intense and awful silence. They had never before heard the whistle of a steamer. "Shout again, quickly," whispered Grenfell to the little African girl. In a second the child's shrill voice rang out in the silence across the water, crying first her brother's name and then her own. The astonished warrior dropped his spear, caught up his paddle, and, in a few swift strokes, drove his canoe towards the steamer. His astonishment at seeing his sister aboard overcame all his dread of this shrieking, floating island that moved without sails or paddles. Quickly she told her story of how the strange white man in the great canoe that smoked had found her in the village of their enemies, had saved her from slavery, and now had brought her safely home again. The story passed from lip to lip. Every spear and bow and arrow was dropped. The girls were quickly put ashore, and as Grenfell walked up the village street, every warrior who had but a few moments before been seeking his blood were now gazing at this strange friend who had brought back to the tribe the daughters whom they thought they had lost forever. Grenfell went on with his work in face of fever, intertribal fighting, slave raiders, the horrors of wife and slave slaughter at funerals, witch killing, and in some ways worse still, the horrible cruelties of the Belgian rubber traders, for over a quarter of a century. In June 1906, accompanied by his Negro companions, he lay at Yalemba, sick with fever. Two of the Africans wrote a letter for help to other missionaries. "We are very sorry," they wrote, "because our master is very sick. So now we begging you one of you let him come to help Mr. Grenfell, please. We think now is near to die, but we don't know how to do with him. Yours, Disasi Makulo Masku Luvusu." Today, all up the 1,500 miles of Congo waterway, the power of the work done by Grenfell and the men who came with him and after him has changed all the life. Gone are the slave traders, the intertribal wars, the cruelties of the white man along that line. There stand instead Negroes who can make bricks, build houses, turn a lathe, engineers, printers, bookbinders, blacksmiths, carpenters, worshipping in churches built with their own hands. But beyond and among the myriad tributaries and the vast forests, millions of men have never yet even heard of the love of God in Jesus Christ, and still work their hideous cruelties. So Grenfell, like Livingstone, opened a door. It still stands open. End of chapter 17.